Thank you, Julie. Before I begin, it's appropriate that I acknowledge what I call Ingungun, my ancestors. It's appropriate that we do that because I am here only because of them. And I ask for their guidance as I try to tell these stories this evening. So as it is appropriate, thank you all for coming out tonight, but as it is appropriate, given all that stuff that Julie was talking about, it means very little if I don't appropriately acknowledge those that made it possible for me to be here. And as it is in this African tradition, if there's an elder in the audience, and I had the great fortune of meeting one just a moment ago, and I'd like to ask him directly, Mr. Judas Green, do I have the permission to speak this afternoon about this topic? Thank you very much, sir. Now it's appropriate, decent, and in order, we can proceed. So thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Julie, for that introduction. This is going to be a great evening of discussion and dialogue about a topic that's very dear to my heart. That is a tremendous amount of materiality around the so-called African slave trade. So let's get started because we're going to have a long way to go. And yes, Julie, I drove down this morning, a little bit of challenge. 3-hour drive took almost 5 hours. But anyway, I'm here and I have a daughter. And as Julie mentioned, I retired in 2017, but I have a daughter who is about 8 months, 3 weeks pregnant, my first grandchild. So I have to, hopefully she holds on. I'm sure she will. But I hope I have to get back and hopefully be there for that very awesome experience. So let's get started. So these are the topics I'm going to try to touch upon this evening. Talk a bit about our organization, Diving with a Purpose, and this whole question of decolonizing the narrative, decolonizing knowledge around as we tell these stories. The critical artifact in these stories is the so-called slave ship. And I'm going to talk a bit about the ones we know about and the ones that we don't have a lot of information about. But central to all these stories is this process of memory reclamation. And I'll talk a bit about that as well, and what that means in terms of cultural heritage. And this ritualistic process of memorialization and reclaiming that memory. And focus, last part of the evening, I'll focus on the South Jose Paquette de Africa and the Clotilda, which I'm very humbled to have put some work in on. So Diving with a Purpose is an organization that was created by an incredible gentleman, co-founded, I should say, by Ken Stewart and Brenda Lazendahl. She was an archaeologist down in Southern Florida. And they just happened to meet and she said, Ken, I need some help. I need some divers. Ken was involved with the National Association of Black Scuba Divers at the time. He said, I know a lot of divers. And she said, well, I got a lot of wrecks. And then so Ken came back and got on the phone and said, calling all these divers and say, hey, y'all want to stop looking at reefs and pretty fish? You want to dive with a purpose? And they said yes, and that's how we got started. And so that was around 2003 or so, and we've trained a lot of folks since then. Our focus right now is to look at vessels that was involved in what is called the transatlantic slave trade. I'm going to change that terminology in a minute, but for now, that's how we got started. There's a niche there that we could fulfill, and so that's what we're focusing on. But right now, we have two main programs that we operate in, one in archaeology, one in coral reef restoration. So we immerse folks into a week of programming down in Southern Florida, teach them basic techniques of documenting a shipwreck. And once they finish that program, they come out certified with as an underwater archaeology advocates. And in this work, we need all the advocates that we can get. And so our end product is usually what we call a composite map of a shipwreck. And this is one of the earlier ones that we produced almost a decade ago, actually, but it's a pretty piece of work. I like to present it. It's called the Hannah M. Bell, and it's down in the Florida Keys National Sanctuary. They didn't quite know the name of this vessel. It was called the Mike's Wreck. And along with the archaeologists down there, Matt Lawrence and Brenda Altmeyer, with the work that we put in and documenting this wreck, we found out that it was this steamer called the Hannah M. Bell. The other part of our program is coral reef restoration. CARES, we call it CARES, Collective Approach to Restoring Our Ecosystem. It's ran by my colleague, Kramer Wimberly. He's a lead instructor in DWP, doing an incredible job with young folks and getting them to not only understand the perils of our coral reef systems, and I've dove on reef systems all over the world, including the Great Barrier Reef. We are in trouble. Every second breath that you take comes from these reef systems. And we need to make, particularly our young folks, as aware as possible, how we can begin to impact these reef systems and how we can begin to change it. Real quickly, we had another project, a very special project. The state of Michigan archaeologist, Wayne Lasordi, called us up and said, man, we just found a P-39 arrow cobra in Lake Michigan. And that arrow cobra would happen to be tied to the Tuskegee Airmen. And so this is Lieutenant Frank Mooley, who tragically died in this accident that was doing live fire training over Lake Huron. And he lost his life in the crash. We went up there and started working this, and through work with Wayne, we was able to identify this aircraft as his aircraft. This is the cockpit of a P-39 Cobra. You look at it there, and we found this cockpit was located on the lake bed. We was able to identify it as his airplane because of this call number right there. That's his call number, 221-227, for Frank Moody in this plane that he was flying, 226 rather. That's me working the tail section. And this is a beautiful artifact, a remnant of that plane. This is the wing. This is the port side wing. You can see the Army star there. It was part of the Army aviation. We didn't have an Air Force back in the beginning of the war in World War II. And the insignia is still there. The navigation light is still there. And Wayne Lasordi, through some CAD work, produced this beautiful drawing of that. That you see the starboard side tie there is still inflated, still had air in it. This is the team that did the work. That's Wayne Lasordi on the left there, and the DW pier. The other young lady, third from left there, is Stephanie. She's with Thunder Bay National Marine Sanctuary. She was on the team as well. But more importantly, this August of 21, we went up there, and to honor these men, we had this great memorial installed on the lakefront up there. So if you're ever up that way, get by there. It's a very beautiful monument right there on the right where St. Clair Lake pours out of Lake Huron into St. Clair River rather. So a bit more about DWP. We have partners. We collaborate. We think collaboration is very, very important. There's a great collaboration here at the Monitor with NOAA, right, around this amazing project. So we partner with a lot of folks as well. And one of our key partnerships with the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, their Shipwrecks project. And essentially, Shipwrecks project is a collaboration itself, where we work with all these partners to, again, seek out and search out and tell these stories of these vessels that was involved in the trade. We have some independent partners. I mentioned the National Marine Sanctuary Florida Keys that we work with, primarily do our training, most of our training with them right now. But we also have a very good collaboration with Society of Black Archaeologists. And this is probably two of their, I call them rock stars. This young man and young lady, Dr. Justin Donovan and Dr. Ayanna Flewellen. Dr. Donovan is at UCLA now. He finished school when he was about 16, college that is, magna cum laude. But anyway, we taught them how to dive, and they took our program, and we've taken off since then, doing some incredible work down in the Caribbean, St. Croix, and other places. Julie mentioned this magazine. This is the March 2022 issue of the National Geographic magazine that sort of tell our stories. And on the cover there's Tara Roberts. Since This magazine has come out. Tara has done some incredible work to expose DWP. She went to the museum in Washington, D.C. there, the National African American Museum, and saw this picture of Ken Stewart, who I mentioned, and these women. That she asked, who is that? And eventually discovered that it was DWP, and she's been telling our story all over the world. It's been absolutely incredible since she got engaged with us. So that's the cover. I call this one the second cover. Well, I'm not, I didn't want to make the cover anyway. It's too much exposure for me. But you can see that her left mask there is fogged up, so they said, oh no, that's a bad cover. So they went with the other one. But it sort of appeased me, I guess. They gave me a spot in the centerfold. And I'm standing there with another young scholar, Jewel Humphrey. She's at UCLA under the counsel of Justin I mentioned earlier. She's just 22 years old in a PhD program in underwater archaeology. And she's working on our winery wrecks down in St. John's, Virgin Island. So let's get into the program real quick. As is entitled, Connecting Ancestral Memory that we need to reclaim in order to tell this full story about that experience. And what I call the decolonization of knowledge, I'm extracting and eliminating from my vocabulary this whole notion of slave. And so instead of the transatlantic slave trade, I think it's appropriate to call it the Transatlantic Era of African enslavements. I don't think my ancestors were ever slaves, they were enslaved. Those people that was put on those vessels, they was mothers, fathers, blacksmiths, priests, uncles, children, nephews, human beings. So we were never slaves. So this is that whole experience, the whole era we call the Maafa. It's a Kiswahili term that means the great disaster. And although our history, that is the history of Africa, didn't start with slavery, in this country we tend to have that sort of misconception. These were very complex societies that was interrupted. This whole experience, enslavement experience, interrupted the forward progress of those people, particularly on the west coast of Africa. And they had profound social frameworks, social orders, if you will. There was no such thing as an old folks' home in these societies because the elderly was integrated into the overall society. No juvenile delinquent centers, if you will, because the youth was initiated into the greater society and they understood what they was there for. So from this point forward, no more use of the term slave. So we're going to have a few discussion questions we're going to try to answer as we go forward here. So can you imagine, these are basically rhetorical. Can you imagine what it would be like to live without memory of who you are, where you came from, your history, your culture? How does memory connect a person to his history and his ancestors? And if you're disconnected from those ancestors and memory, how does it affect your identity, who you are, your role, if you will, in terms of your family and the human family? That disconnection is very, very profound. And people of African descent, particularly, has been traumatized because of that disconnection. We've been walking around basically off balance. It's like a huge hole in your soul when you're disconnected, not knowing. I can take my ancestors maybe back to my great-granddaddy. And then we get to what we call the 1865 wall, right? When those records disappear, no names, maybe a first name, but you don't know exactly who they are. So it's a huge, huge thing for me, because identity and cultural identity particularly is very important to our humanity. We need to know who our grandparents are, our ancestors, where we came from. But more importantly, how did it become possible for a nation founded on the principles, democratic principles of freedom and justice for all, that allow over 200 years of shackle slavery? How did, in the shaping of so-called this Western civilization, have a global system of brutal bondage and oppression existed for more than 400 years and not being deeply embedded in our memory, in who we are? We should all be aware of this tragedy, this horrific, this maafa that's happening, that has happened. But yet there's efforts for us to forget, right? And so it's like an amnesia. so our collective memory, we can't really move forward if we don't collectively remember and engage these things that is real bad. Now, we are the land of the free and home of the brave, but are we brave enough to engage our past and talk seriously about it and correct these tragedies that has happened in our past? I think we are. And I think the stories that that we bring out by doing this work helps as well. Cultural heritage plays an important part of that as well. And I just use this graphic from a very powerful exhibition called Afro Histories of the Atlantic. This young man is pouring white paint over his head so he can forget. So reclamation of social memory and identity is very, very important. So restoring that memory and collective identity is absolutely essential if we're going to repair the harm that has been done, right? So we need to identify and connect with that. I know it's difficult at times, but we have to find the space and the opportunities to look at all these intersectionalities among cultures and so forth and have these profound conversations so we can move forward as a human family. And we need to pay more attention to those indigenous sort of knowledges. So that's the whole process of decolonization, connecting with those indigenous knowledges that can inform us, actually, particularly in this memory reclamation process. Matter of fact, just because the memory is oral, we have an oral tradition, doesn't mean that it can't be informed. It can't inform us about tradition and knowledge. Matter of fact, if you really engage seriously, ancient African, and even more so recent African history and culture, what you will discover is that out of Africa became this whole ideal of what it means to be human, And actually, some studies have been done with these oral traditions, found out that those people have better memory capabilities than civilizations that have written scripts. So we know about the terror, the murder, and so forth, and we should focus a bit more on the resistance of what we call the Transatlantic Era of the African enslavement. I won't go into a lot of detail. That was from Amistad, whom you're probably aware of. Other resistance from Nat Turner, Zumbia Palmares in Brazil. So there was resistance, but yet today we see manifestations of this whole experience. And there's something called the transgeneration epigenetic trauma that we see manifest. That is, if anyone in your lineage or genealogy have had traumatic experiences, it is embedded. Your gene is actually encoded, and it's been scientifically proven. With this trauma, the gene doesn't change, but it's a marker placed on that gene that you pass on generation to generation until there's some healing, until the harm is undone. Then we can have more pleasant experience as human beings. So we're still suffering the epigenetic trauma. And I'm going to show you some examples of how it affects me when I dive on these shipwrecks. This is a beautiful piece of art done by this profound artist out in California named Claudia Rawls. She called it the space in which we travel. And with Toni Morrison, this quote sort of is a great metaphor in terms of what it says here. All water has a perfect memory. It is forever trying to get back to where it was, like our memories, trying to get back, find a way so we can remember again. But more importantly, if you look at that art, the art piece there, these are two women underwater. Are they happy? Are they dancing? Are they joyful? But they're totally submerged. But more importantly, look at their arms there. What does kind of symbolically, what does that remind you of? This is sort of my interpretation. It's like a DNA helix, right? And so that's part of the trauma that is being depicted here from my perspective. Other poets and writers and creative people have expressed their thoughts about the crossing of the Atlantic by these, as academics say, about 12.4 million people, but it was many, many more than that. I use the number around 15 million or so. The great St. Vincent poet, Derek Walcott, out of a phrase from one of his poem, The Sea is History, he says, bones soldered by coral to bone, mosaics, mantled by the benediction of the shark's shadow. Lucille Clifton is the former Port Laureate of Maryland. She said in her piece, Atlantic is a sea of bones. Atlantic is a sea of bones, my bones, elegant African bones, connecting Rita and New York, a bridge of ivory, seabed, they call it. So this is recognized by UNESCO in terms of underwater cultural heritage and how we should find a way to memorialize those that on the bottom of the seabed. And we know from the historical record there are some 2 million Africans on the bottom of the seabed. No one has never told them to rest in peace. There's never been a ritualistic burial of these individuals. So how do we go about memorializing them and acknowledging their humanity? So we're doing, there's a project to find a way to do that because there's a lot of mining for rare minerals that's going on the bottom of the Atlantic seabed particularly, and those bones are being disturbed. We put down a memorial for the Henrietta Marie, we being the National Association of Black Scuba Divers, a while back to at least how we go about symbolically acknowledging those individuals. So the slave ship, as I said earlier, the slave ship is probably the most important artifact in this whole story. Okay, there's a book that was written by Marcus Rediker called The Slave Ship, A Human History. And he sort of summarized in this passage here the real meaning of the slave ship. I won't read the whole thing, but you can look at it. In essence, what he's saying that the seizure of new lands and expropriation of millions of people for economic reasons, for the cultivation of tobacco and sugar and so forth, and said slowly but fitfully, uneven but with undoubted power, a world market and international capitalist system emerged. Each phase of the process, from exploration to settlement, to produce trade and construction of a new economic order. And he said the Guineaman, what he called the slave ship, was at the very center of this whole operation. So that makes that artifact, that vessel, very, very important. These are some of the roots of the transoceanic trade of enslavement. And the number of vessels that has been involved in this process over the 300 to 400 years, there was 12,000 ships involved in the trade. Some 40,000 voyages was made from those ships. We know about 1,000 or so, about 1,020 or so wrecking events from all those voyages. There was probably many, many more. These are the ones that we have some sort of awareness of, according to the slave voyages database. That this involved the movement of some 12 to 15 million human beings against their will, the largest mass movement of humanity recorded in human history. So again, why isn't it part of our collective memory? How many, this is not necessarily a challenge, but in our educational process, how many slave ships can you name, actually? If we eliminate the Amistad, say, which is one of the most popular ones. We're talking about 12,000 vessels. The primary reason we are here today, mostly, major contribution to the development of Western civilization. I was recently in Lisbon, Portugal, a few weeks ago. Portugal played a major role in moving all those people across the Atlantic. You can see here in the red numbers kind of highlight that. The vertical ones over their whole period of involvement. But the latter part of the 18th century, they moved some almost 5 million of those people just in that time period alone. But in Portugal, there's virtually no memorialization of their involvement in the Transatlantic Era of African enslavement. What they glorify is the exploration, the adventures of Henry the Navigator and others, but yet do not acknowledge their role in the trade. So we had some deep discussions about that with the museum folks over there. And if you know Lonnie Bunch, you've heard of Lonnie Bunch. He's the current secretary of the Smithsonian. He was with us, and we had some real good, serious dialogues and conversations. And hopefully those conversations will continue. And we will, just state the facts, state the truth of that involvement and start this healing process. These are some of the known vessels, the ones highlighted as ones that I've had some engagement with, but it's only about 15 of them. I'm sure you're very well aware of the Queen Anne's Revenge. That ultimately was a vessel involved in the Transatlantic Era of African enslavement, but ended up being a pirate vessel right here, right on your coast here. I forgot the inlet. Someone help me where it was found. Beaufort Inlet. So, but anyway, these are the vessels that we have some sense of that's in the historical record that we know of. So real quickly, let me just introduce you to a few more, and you can expand your knowledge of their awareness. First, I'll talk about the Merriman real quick. The Merriman was a Dutch East African Company vessel. It was trying to sail it left Madagascar. It was trying to get around the Cape. There was a rebellion on board. I talk about how the Dutch East Indian Company was the world's first conglomerate that was involved in all sorts of commodities, including human beings. But in this case, on the Merriman, there was a revolt by this man, Masavana. They revolted, took over the ship, and Masavana demanded they kill a few of the crew. The rest of the crew retreated back into the stern of the vessel and locked themselves there. But the captives didn't know how to sail the vessel. They negotiated, and this negotiation ended up them being betrayed, essentially. The crew said, yes, we'll sail you back to Madagascar. But ultimately, they sailed them on to Cape Town, South Africa. And by pure luck, the captain put a message in the bottle, threw it out the window. They watched the shore. There was a militia there, seeing a strange vessel out there on the horizon. They had formed. They picked up the bottle, read the message. It says, light 3 fires if this is Madagascar. That was the agreement. So they lit 3 fires. Masavana and his team went ashore. They was happy. Of course, some of them was killed immediately. Masavana was arrested, and he was put on trial. There's a record of his trial. And this, to the lower left there is the Lion's Head looking over Cape Town, South Africa. In the upper right there, out in the distance, is this island called Robben Island, the island that Nelson Mandela was in prison on. We believe that's where Masavana was ultimately buried. The Zong Massacre. Are you familiar with the Zong Massacre? In November 1781, some 132 Africans were thrown overboard to collect the insurance on them because of the incompetence of a captain. He misnavigated. He was trying to get to Jamaica. He missed it and sailed into the wide open Gulf. And he found out they didn't have enough provisions to get back. And so he decided, well, I can start throwing them overboard. And it's just laid out there. Check out this story. I'm going to go into a lot of detail with it. Another one called the Le Roudeur, excuse my French, but it had 39 Africans was thrown overboard after they contracted this eye disease. And another boat pulled along the side of them called the Lion. They came alongside, and everyone on that boat was infected as well. So the Lion separated from the Le Roudeur, and the Lion has never been heard from. There's no historical record of the Lion. The Lucerne is another incredible story. The Lucerne was, again, a Dutch West Indian Company vessel. It sailed in 1738. This vessel is called it was the Panamax of the day, if you will. It had over 700 individuals on it. And because of, again, maybe an incompetent captain, he misnavigated. He was trying to get into Suriname, Paramaribo, but he went up the wrong river. He was trying to get up the Suriname River, and he reversed course, coming back out of I think it's called the Mari River. But once he came out on the Delta, a storm hit. We think it was a tornado. He decided to drop anchor. He dropped the bow anchor, swung the vessel around, and slammed into a reef. It breached the hull, started taking on water. And what happened next was probably the most tragic maritime incident involved in the Transatlantic Era of African enslavement. He gave the order to his crew to abandon ship. But before you abandon ship, crew, lock the hatches down. He locked the hatches down, and over 2 or 3 day period, 700 individuals locked in chains fell into the sea. Do we know about those individuals? How do we bring them back to memory? So we do know. Give them the humanity that they so deeply respect, earn rather. This is a Guerrero. DWP saw the guy that started from the Guerrero. It was a Spanish pirate vessel. And the tragedy of these individuals that is on this vessel is just horrific. They was captured off the coast of West Africa, on the ways to the Americas, to Cuba to be exact. The vessel got hijacked, and so they were stolen again and put on this pirate vessel. Slavery was abolished around 1808 in British and the U.S., and so they had these interdiction African fleets, if you will, that was trying to prevent the importation of Africans into the U.S. There was a British vessel that intervened on behalf of the Guerrero. He pursued it when it was approaching the coast of Florida off of Key Largo. Guerrero ended up running aground, and the number followed. The Guerrero was a total loss. 41 individuals was killed in that wrecking event, and the number lost his rudder. Overnight, the pirates stole again about 300 of those people that was on the Guerrero and took them on to Florida. There was about 120 or so that was on the British vessel that was able to take the rudder off the Guerrero, put it on the nimble. They sailed those folks into Key West, where they languished for about 3 years before the government got involved. And we know, this is some of the work that we was doing down there. I mentioned Kramer Wimmerly. That's Kramer there, who was leading our other program. He's pointing at a cannonade, which we think was offloaded off the nimble because it was sitting on a reef. It refloated about 2 or 3 times, but they offload the armaments and things to light load it so it floats on high tide. And we know that they were shooting cannonballs and bar shots and others. These are some of the things that was bar shots and cannonballs that was found on the site. We haven't exactly located the Guerrero, but it's a good possibility that it might be in the National Park Service, Biscayne National Park, and also maybe even in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Those boundaries abut each other. We think the nimble might be in the park and Guerrero might be in the sanctuary. We're going to take some young people down there, hopefully this summer, to investigate some more what we call anomalies that we found doing magnetometer or work, and see if we can bring this story, not necessarily to a conclusion, to put more information out there for memory. This is Higgs Beach in Key West. If you haven't been down to Key West, when the individuals, 120 or so individuals, sailed from the wrecking event down into Key West, a few of them died, and they buried them on this beach. But more importantly, those vessels at the bottom there, about 1,500 individuals have been taken off these vessels and brought into Key West as well. And a number of them, hundreds of them, had died on the journey into Key West, and they're buried on Higgs Beach. That was discovered about 20 years ago by doing some ground penetrating radar work on this beach. Archaeology by the name of Corey Malcolm was really led this effort. And so we memorialized them by putting this monument up there. So those are the story of a few shipwrecks. I want to talk more specifically in a little bit more detail in the remaining time here about the South Jose Paquete de Africa. The South Jose Paquete de Africa was a Portuguese vessel. It was sailing from Mozambique, going around the Cape, and it crashed on the rocks in the Cape. So take a listen to this video. It's about 2.5 minutes. Give you a little bit more about the South Jose.
The African Shipwrecks project is a collaboration among 6 African and American partners to search for, document, preserve, display, and learn from shipwrecks related to the global slave trade. In February 2013, this international team of divers made new discoveries near Cape Town, South Africa, that with further study promised to identify the site of the São José, a ship that was carrying over 500 enslaved persons from Mozambique to Brazil when it wrecked in 1794.
The São José site is a pretty interesting site. It's very dynamic in that there's a lot of sand movement on the site, so it's not a very easy site to work on. There's a lot of kelp movement on the site, and there's a lot of surge. So
the wreck is about 40 feet or so. You can see the dive environment. There's a lot of surge moving back and forth. 10 to 20 foot surge. We got the divers in all this. Carl is a very strong diver. We were setting up to do some dredging work. I like nice, warm blue water. I was telling you earlier. This water is around 45 degrees.
Well, what's been exciting this year is we've been able to get on the site quite a bit, and we have had our
So the
colleagues
thing,
over
most of
from
the
the States,
material is
and they
buried
brought a
beneath
new dredger for
all
us.
these
So we
sands.
were
That's
able
why
to
we're
use that
doing
dredger quite
dredging
effectively
among
and
the
work with the
rocks.
site and open up a new area that we haven't opened up before.
How was your dive, Kamau?
It was great, fantastic.
What did you get to see?
Oh, I found something of interest. It was a piece of iron slag, I think. It seemed like a wood material. It had a fastener to it. So I don't know if it's significant or not, but maybe we can check it out a little further and find out.
This is the Uncle Bishop.
Yeah, that's all metal. That's all of it. We've got enough information to actually say that this is direct, although we need very much more clarity. And that involves what we're doing now, is to try and find the smoking gun.
So that was another little piece there, not that important.
The
But
African Shipwrecks project is a collaboration among 6 African and American partners to search for, document, preserve.
Can't get the bar to come back.
Display and learn from shipwrecks.
But anyway, it was just some commentary I put at the end there about, how that whole process affected me. So the South Sudan, Phuket, Africa, Yako, the principal investigator, had done some research and discovered the captain's deposition about the wreck. He reported back to the Portuguese about the wrecking event. And so this is his deposition, but the highlighted piece there showed how the thinker was separating the actual so-called captives from the people. He tried to say, they made a clear distinction there that the captives were not human beings. And he went on to talk about how they tried to save themselves and so forth. And the 212 individuals that died on this wreck site. There was about 400 or so on the vessel when it went down. And but the ones that were rescued, they sold into enslavement in the Western Cape of South Africa. So remember you saw the lines here earlier? And so that in his deposition, he talks about where the location of the ship was. And that gave Yako and his team an idea of where that wreck was located, off of Clifton Beach, off the beach in Cape Town. This is Cape Town down here, called Sea Point area of Cape Town. And the wreck is right out there. And so it's located right above, on this beach here. That's a rock called Cherry Rock. That's the rock that is struck. And so the wreckage is right in this area right here. These are some artifacts that we retrieved off the South Sudan. These are ballasts. And we knew from the work that Jacob Bischoff and his folks did in terms of archival research, that there was about 1,600 of these iron ballasts on the South Sudan. These ballasts are on exhibit now in the National Museum of African American History and Culture. If you ever make it to Washington, D.C., please visit that museum. You can see these artifacts. This wooden pulley block was discovered. That's it, X-rated and in situ. The wooden timbers. This is one of my first visual of the South Sudan when I saw it. And it was just incredible, just diving in that cold water and then coming across this material. I just remember distinctively reaching out and touching it, and I kind of tell this story quite frequently. I just felt the horror and the pain and the suffering made my eyes water underwater. It was quite an incredible experience, and embodying those experiences. And this is a shackle that's in situ on the left there that I ran across during the dredging operation. And there's a story with that, but maybe we can share it a little later. But we found out it's a shackle again. All types of shackles are on display off this wreck in the museum, including little tiny ones. That's what the most difficult ones for me to look at for children. Again, these individuals on the South Sudan came from, as I mentioned, Mozambique. This is the island of Isle. This is Madagascar. Just to give you a geographical reference here. This is Mozambique. There's an island there called the Ilha de Mozambique, where those people came from. Give you a better sense of that island. This is the island. This is the island here. This is the Indian Ocean over here, the Madagascar Channel. And this is a bay here called Musarel Bay. And those people came from this area here, a district called Musarel District. So we treat these sites as very sacred sites, particularly when there's loss of life. Again, on the South Sudan, there was 212 we know that came from this, or at least they were gathered at this particular village. Some of them came from inland, most of Musarel village. So we went back and told that the elders and the people of that village that we found the space, the wreck where your ancestors lost their lives. And this elder, along with the whole village, came out for this particular ceremony that he did. We spoke all day and telling us about the honor and pride of their people and so forth. And then he went and scooped up some earth from this village and put it in this vessel he's holding in his hand there. Dr. Bunch was with us as well. He gave that vessel to Dr. Bunch and said, I want you to take this earth from our village, from our home, to that wretched site and bring our people back home. Dr. Bunch gave that vessel to me through a little ritual we did in South Africa, Cape Town. This is the last visual that those people saw. This is called a ramp of enslavement, a ramp of the slaves. And them looking back, this is the last visual they saw of their homeland. So we went back to Clifton Beach. You can see Cherry Rock to the left there. And myself representing the African diaspora, if you will, the young lady you saw rolling back off the boat on the video, Tara, and Yara, who was a Makua youth. Intention was to dive on the wreck and deposit the soil, but the sea was, quote, angry that morning. And I hate to use that term, but the sea was very rough. And so we waded out as close as we could, and we deposited the soil into the surf. I recall we waiting out there, and I had this, it was media came from all over the world, media all over the place. And I had this little thing I wanted to say, but I couldn't do it. And so we deposited that soil and hopefully brought some peace to those 212 that went down on the South Sudan. So we went back to the Makua village, to the elder, that's him there, standing there. There was a book that the principal investigators wrote called From No Return about this whole experience. So we presented a copy to him. And we told him what we did. We had fulfilled his wish to bring his people back home. And there was a profound, pregnant moment there. He just paused. And if I can paraphrase, he said, now the rain that falls on our village is like the tears of our people coming back home. And lastly, the Clotilda story. We'll wrap it up here. You heard of the Clotilda. It's a story of incredible resistance and resilience. The Clotilda was a ship that sailed from the Bay of Mobile Bay, out of the Mobile Bay, went to Ouida, which was the city on the coast of Benin at the time, Dahomey at the time, which currently is Benin, sailed back to Mobile Bay. They left in March of 1860, arrived back in July of 1860, and deposited 110 Africans into enslavement. All because of a bet that Timothy Mayer made that he could do this. And he was influenced by another historical event we should have some awareness about. It was the penultimate vessel that brought Africans into the U.S. called the Wanderer. And it brought over 400 individuals into the U.S. off of Jekyll Island. But that's another story. We haven't found the Wanderer yet, but it's on the DWP radar. So these are the conspirators. Timothy Mayer. William Foster was the captain of the vessel. And he made a statement that after transferring the individuals off the vessel into a smaller river vessel, that he took the Clotilda upriver and set it on fire to destroy the evidence. The federal authorities supposedly was on him, and they was getting afraid they might find the evidence, i.e. the Clotilda. So this shows you the location of the Tilda. That's Mobile, Alabama. Right above Mobile is a place called Africatown. Right after the Civil War, about 35 or so descendants of the individuals that was on this boat established this community. They asked Timothy Mears to give them some land, but he refused, and they actually put their resources together to buy some acreage here and establish what they call Africatown some 162 years ago. And so William Foster sailed it up here, upriver here. That's 12 Mile Island right there. And that little spot there marks the location of the Clotilda. That's 12 Mile Island there. So back in 2018, a reporter down there thought they had ran across the remains of the Clotilda. And of course, it was a false alarm. It wasn't the Clotilda. We went down there and investigated it. It didn't fit the specifications of the Clotilda that we had. So the descendant community had high expectations. And so they began to call it the no-tilda. But we went back in July of that year, 2018, with some other technologies, side scan sonars, magnetometers, sub-bottom profilers. This is the location. We went up and down the river, and this area of the river is like a ship junkyard. Mariners would take derelict vessels on this side of the channel because it's not navigable. Corps of Engineers doesn't dredge it. They dredge on the other side of the island. And so there's all sort of derelict vessels underwater along there. So we had a number of anomalies. We knew the specifications we were looking for, and we narrowed it down to 3. And this is the mere property here. I don't know if you can see it in this picture here, but there's a cabin right there. And right in here is a property marker that it has mirror on it. This is the property marker. So we knew we was close. This is a side scan sonar that we came up with here. This is the Clotilda here. It's in the Mobile River. The bow, this is the bow, is pointing upstream. And you can see a lot of timbers, trees, and disarticulated members around it. This is a scan from July 18. Went back and got another scan to see changing conditions in February of 21. So this is extremely important artifact. Nothing else in the historical record exists like this, where you can actually see the hull of a vessel involved in the Transatlantic Era of African enslavement still intact. What's even more profound, at least for me, the space in which those 110 individuals in is still very much there. There's no other space like that in the world. Of all the vessels that was involved in the trade, the wreckage has been either lost or been strewn across the seabed. So this is an extremely valuable artifact in telling this story. And real quickly at some of the artifacts and some of the things we knew about it, we knew it was a 2-masted schooner that had a centerboard. That's when it's on the way in the open sea, it would drop that board down for more stability. We knew it had copper sheathing on it to prevent the torino worms and worms from eating up the sides and last a little bit longer. We knew there was burning. There was evidence of burning. And as I mentioned earlier, we had the registration, certificate registration of the Clotilda. So we had those specifications you see on the left side. And so this is what we found. We found from our survey that it was about 85 to 90 feet long, had a breadth of about the beam, the width of the ship of about 23 feet, and so on. And it was burned and sank. We found some evidence of burning, metal sheathing, as I mentioned, the centerboard, and sunk in about 20 feet of water. And I give Dr. Robinson some props here. This is an incredible book that she wrote about the experience. She talked about that. There's a few others that talks about the experience as well. Subian Juke book, Streams of Africa in Alabama. And the most recent piece added to the story is Zora Neale Hurston's piece that was published recently as well. So we know who those individuals were that established Africatown. So in part of this memorialization and remembering, we can still call out their names. And we do call out their names. So Zula, Oluwale, Kazola. We call out Ridoshi. We call out their names and say Matilda McCree, one of the last individuals who transitioned back in the 1930s. Kopole, Osakidi, Abachi, Claire Turner, Charlie Lewis. We call their names to remember, Gumper, Pete Lee. And so they established a community, as I mentioned, called Africa Town, and the only real remnants of that community now is this chimney here of Gumper Pete's homestead. And you can see this major thoroughway here that wasn't there before. The state of Alabama put a major state road right down the community, separated the community from a very sacred and profound space, the African graveyard there that have, late 18th, 19th century graves in that cemetery. This is a church that was established by Kazola, one of the leaders of the community that established Africa Town. And this is an early memorial of him here. This is a more recent one. The church is still standing there, Union Baptist Church. Again, it's right across from the cemetery here. In the cemetery, they have, again, where all those descendants are buried, and this is one of the markers for Kazula. This is not where he's buried, but he knows he's in that cemetery somewhere. I don't know the exact location. So back in May of this year, we went back and did a more thorough investigation of the site. We called in some commercial divers to clear the site. They started removing trees and other disarticulated members. We extracted some 94 pieces of material from the wreck. That's Dr. Jim Delgado. He's the principal investigator, along with Ayana and Justin, I mentioned earlier, Dr. Fluellen and Dr. Donovan. So we're investigating and cataloging that material. We put it all back. We put it all back on the vessel, except for about 4 pieces that we're conserving right now. And these are some of the pieces. There's a hawse pipe here. And this piece here is very, very interesting. These are some of the conservators. Now, we had this huge tank that we was placing them in before we cataloged them and put them back on the ship. This is a pulley from the steering mechanism of the Clotilda that guided the rudder. And you look real carefully there. Will Hoffman and I was talking earlier about ropes, and the rope is still entwined around this pulley. An excellent diagnostic tool. You can find out how it was braided. You can get a lot of information extracted from that one diagnostic. So I was talking to someone earlier today about these artifacts and things that we're discovering on these shipwrecks. We measure these artifacts, we cut them, we analyze, we x-ray them, and so forth and so on to get the scientific information to inform the story. But there's another whole dimension here that I think has sort of been mentioned that we're missing. This. The spiritual essence of artifacts, I call it, but it's just another dimension, more humane sort of dimension. When we look at this material culture, I think we can gain deeper insight if we pay more attention to that aspect. We can actually hear using our hands if we really pay close attention. There's an archaeologist in Australia named Dr. Ian McLeod. He talks about this a little bit. Talks about the spiritual dimension and assessments of condition reports and artifacts. And when dealing with shipwreck sites where people have actually perished, it becomes even more important. He went on to say that natural prescriptive processes do not work when managing the intangible side of these artifacts. But unless such issues are addressed, there will be a continuing disconnect between the best outcomes for collections and this material. But once we are sensitized to capturing and working with these intangible elements, museum professors, curators, archaeologists, they will be transformed into a new realm of understanding what the real true meaning is about these artifacts. This is a time lapse of the Clotilda. I showed you the 2018. This is 2020, and this is more recent in August 2021. You can see some of the debris is removed. And this is a more recent one we took in May. You can see that all the disarticulated material has been removed. And those are trees that we removed. We're looking upriver here. That's the bow of the vessel. And you can obviously see the hull of the outline here. And so some of the aspects of that image is that, again, the bow, that's what's called a bulkhead there. There's another bulkhead here. But we found evidence there was a false bulkhead, a temporary one that was added here. So in this space right here is the space where the 110 individuals endured the crossing of the Atlantic. And it's 26 by 18 to 23 foot space here. That's no bigger than the space right up here. So if all y'all come up here and just stand right here, you get a sense of what it was like. You just stand there for 3 months and, I don't know, maybe an earthquake or something, you get an experience of the turbulence that these individuals experience. So diving into that space was an extremely humbling experience for me, particularly under the conditions. This is an image of the bow of the Clotilda. Yes, this is the best visual conditions of visibility we had the whole time. There's about 3-4 inches of visibility there. So in order to interrogate the vessel, we had to feel. So I went down on the bow, feeling my way down the bow, got to that first bulkhead that I showed you, and went over into that space. I'm having relapse here. So going into that space, it was very, 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 very moving and profound. I began to tumble around. As Julie mentioned, I got over 1,400 dives, and I knew a little bit about being buoyant in the water, right? But when I got in that space, it was just tumbling. And after about 15 seconds or so, I was able to at least find my balance. And my dive buddy, who was following me through the wreck, we began to interrogate the space in there. The floorboard is missing on the bottom of the vessel, and the post that was supporting the floorboard where the individual was laying on, they are still there. There's a little shelf there that some few individuals on, and some of that shelving is still there as well. So I knew I was going to be diving this vessel, and I knew how it was going to affect me, how I tend to embody this work. So right before diving this vessel, I have a dear friend, her name is Sabrina Johnson, and we said, well, you're going to have to find a way to acknowledge, excuse me, please, acknowledge these individuals. So we came up with this idea of reciting a prayer, an ancestral prayer. And that's me about to enter the water. I paused and recited this prayer. Ancestral prayer, first dive on the Clotilda, reviving spirits who travel on the Clotilda. Beloved ancestors, your voices have been quiet for 162 years, but your silence ends now. Your voices and memory are lifted now from this wretched vessel through us, and we welcome you to speak through us. Our connection will never be broken. We are because of you. Thank you for reaching out to us. Blessings to your spirit always. So some of the artifacts that we're recovering from the hotel that will be on display in this heritage house that's under construction. It's almost completed. So hopefully it will create some ecotourism, economic boom for the community. We'll see how that goes. There's a lot of attention now on the Clotilda. If you saw the movie Descendant, the environmental injustice that's going on there, all those efforts are continuing. The EPA is involved to try to bring about some justice for this community that's been struggling for so long. I've started, along with my colleagues and through a grant from the Smithsonian, we started a swim to scuba program. And these are some of the swim instructors that we use for our pre-COVID. Went down there once pre-COVID. COVID came and knocked the program off the radar. But we're just gearing up again to start that program again. What it is, we're working with the YMCA down there that's teaching these youngsters how to swim. And once they learn how to swim and get their skills up, we start them a certification process to get them scuba diving. And the intent is that young man to get them to dive on the Clotilda. And these are descendant children from Africa Town. Can you imagine what that would be like? Unprecedented. Excuse me. So wrapping up here, of course, you've seen some of this material, these documentaries of the Clotilda. And of course, the most recent one, The Descendant, that's streaming now on Netflix. It made the top 10 list for an Oscar nomination. Or unfortunately, it didn't make the top 5 list, but that's okay. We're telling the story anyway. I think it's the Oscars loss, right? And this, we had the museum exhibit that I talked about earlier. And DWP is continuing to search for vessels. I mentioned the Wanderer. He has an incredible story. Each one of these vessels have an incredible story. The Aurora vessel, the French vessel that was also came out of Mozambique. Over 400 individuals lost in that wrecking event. We know hardly nothing about, but Shipwrecks Project, along with those partners I mentioned, that we made some incredible discoveries just this past summer. And so there's going to be more coming out on that. I don't want to get ahead of it. We really would love to find the Lewiston that I mentioned earlier, where they locked down the hatches. And then there's some ships we know that was involved in the Black Star Line. That's Marcus Garvey's ships. But we know there's one up in the Hudson River and one that crashed off the coast of Cuba. So I really thank you for listening and coming out this evening. And hopefully this was insightful for you. And thank you, Mariners Museum, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Kamau. You made me cry again.
Oh,
just like you did in that Descendant movie. We are going to have questions, I hope. Anyone in the room have some? And then we're going to have online questions with Jenna. Yes, ma'am, I'll bring you this. Put it up there.
So if the Clotilda was an illegal slave ship, when was the last legal slave transfer?
Probably one that before 1808. So that's when the law took effect, January 1, 1808. So I don't know what exact ship that was, but again, in the U.S. and Britain basically passed the law at the same time that they would not allow the importation of enslaved people into the U.S. and Britain. But the whole system of enslavement continued to operate. But yeah, good question. Actually got me wondering, what was that last ship prior to that time period?
I'm coming to you, sir. And then we'll have an online question after yours. Jenna.
During that time when you were underground, when you ran across those individuals just before you cited your particular prayer, those individuals, are those skeletons which you were actually looking at? In addition to that, have we done anything as far as consuming those particular skeletons to bring them about for proper burial?
Yeah, if I understand your question correctly. So we was on a barge in the middle of the Mobile River. And that's why I recited the prayer before diving on the Clotilda. The question about whether we discovered any human remains, and all the wrecks that I've had the opportunity to work on, we have not discovered any human remains. Excuse me, a good candidate would probably be the South Jose. There's probably 6 to 10 feet of sand that's been deposited over top of those wrecks. And so we were dredging. That's when the movie cut off there. We know there's a possibility of human remains being found on that site. Matter of fact, our first exploration there, we had a human remains anthropologist in case we ran across some material. But yeah, there's a high probability for that happening. We're pretty sure that, but there's an effort to establish some lanes, if you will, across the Atlantic. We know those routes that most of the ship took. And then during this mining process, we're pretty sure that they're going to disturb something. If there's a discovery, we're trying to set up a protocol. This is what you do if that happens. Stop operations, acknowledge this individual, and then notify the proper persons to decent, in a very decent way, deal with those remains.
Jenna, we'll have two questions. One in the room.
How can a person support your work and organization if they do not dive? Do you offer tours for non-divers or a way for people to participate?
You really get that question a lot, and my response, somewhat facetiously but seriously, go to the website and hit the donate button. But yeah, we have people who provide all sort of support for us. We need archivists, researchers to do some of this work. But we always say there's only two types of peoples in the world. That's divers and those who soon will be divers. So if you approach us, you're going to end up being a diver. But if you want to reach out to us, if you've got a particular skill set, grant writing, development work, we need that sort of assistance as well. Most of this work is supported through grants and basically donations. We have a youth diving with the purpose program, and we try to provide it at virtually no cost to the young folks, and we've done that for the last 6-7 years. We want to maintain that, remove that burden from those youth and their families so they can participate and learn these little skills. So I would suggest the questioner to contact us, and whatever skill sets you can bring those, but if you can also bring your purse, we appreciate that too.
And the next question is, this one's deep for you, which is great. How would you describe your first experience or two in and on the water during your childhood? Where did it take place, and was it a positive one?
During my childhood? Yes. Yes, I remember very clearly. That was, I'm born and raised in a community in South Carolina, actually, Greenwood, South Carolina. And that's where I learned how to swim. And of course, I grew up in abject poverty. So every summer when school was out, that was the number one thing we did. We would go around searching for drink bottles, pop bottles, and take them to the store and trade them in for 2 cents a piece or something like that, if I remember correctly, just to get enough money to go to the segregated swimming pool to get in. It cost about 25 cents or something like that. If we didn't get enough bottles, what we would do, the Army reserves, every summer you got to do your training, right? So they dug this huge pond, a mud hole, if you will. So when they leave, we go jump in the pond and swim. Used to go fishing a lot with my dad, and when the fish wasn't biting, we would join them. So those are my earlier childhood experience from growing up in South Carolina and those beautiful summers being in the water down there.
So between the wrecks that you showed of the Clotilda, the side scan sonar, it seemed that there was a lot of loss of material around the bow section. And so with the river moving and the wreck being pointed upstream, is the wreck site, in jeopardy in any sense? Yes.
There's a lot of dynamics that's putting the wreck site in jeopardy, and stuff that's coming downstream, as you can. So it's been bombarded for the last 162 years. Some of those big trees, I'm talking big trees, has impacted the wreck, yeah. But the bow is pretty much intact. The wave cutter, the stem has been knocked away a little bit. Part of it is missing, but for the most part, the integrity is still there. So this last mission we was on back in May, we had a specialist with us, and the report should be coming out real soon. And his main mission was, how can we best protect this wreck in situ where it lies right now? So a lot of information or data was collected, the currents, the water quality, the biology in the water, being hit by these structures. Even if there's some erosion of the sediment that we think is basically, at least for the stern section, that's about 40% of the soil is buried in sediment, river sediment. If that gets removed, how that will affect the structure of the vessel. So hopefully in this report, it will say exactly what the integrity of the vessel is, and the decisions will be made going forward, the best way to preserve it. I know the descendant community is real keen on maybe lifting this boat out of the water and putting it on display and maybe around that heritage house that I just showed you. But that's a very expensive proposition, as Will and others here at the museum. You're dealing with the monitor, the cost there. So it's very expensive. Initial estimates of 15 million plus just to get it out of the water. And if you take it out of that environment, that sediment is removed, it would jeopardize the integrity of the vessel. So my personal position is leave it in situ. There's a power about the power of place where it lies. And it adds to the story right where it lies. And if you take it out of that environment, not only the conservation costs, but I think it will accelerate the deterioration of the vessel as well. I mean, if you heard of the Bassa that sunk, and they pulled the whole ship out, they're struggling with trying to preserve that thing now because they're seeing some deterioration. I think the greatest value is to leave it in the water, and we'll have it for much longer if we leave it in situ in the water.
Jenna, another question?
Yes. How many or have any members of the Clotilda Descendants Association participated in dives to that wreck?
At this point, none. We've had some good dialogue. There's a couple of members that say they want to learn how to dive, and we hope to get them certified if they're physically able. There are some young folks. If you remember the young man that had the dreadlocks in the movie, Emmett, and he's expressed interest in diving. Another descendant named Darren Patterson, he's expressed interest. So, we hope to get some of those descendants certified. And again, it's a very high risk environment. Not only from the debris, most of it's been removed, but some of it's being collected around the wreck as we speak. There's sharp edges, there's planks and other materials. There's even water moskins in the water. So it's a very high-risk environment. So they definitely have to be well-trained, and hopefully we can get them there and have that incredible experience. I mean, I can't imagine what that's going to be like.
Thank you, Kamau, for showing her book. That was very nice. And Kamau will be in the lobby talking by his display back there about diving with a purpose. So go visit with our special guest and mingle among yourselves, if you will, and we look forward to seeing you soon. Our next evening lecture is April, so we don't have one in March, but April 20th, Buddy Levy is coming back to talk about Empire of Ice and Stone, another very chilling. I was reading it at night before I was trying to go to sleep, and it was really something. It's a true story of the Carlocks, so do come for that, and thank you all again for being with us and for your support of the museum.
Yeah,
Good night.
Thank you all. Thank you for coming out.